Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to writing our first VBA code in PowerPoint. In this brief video, let's preview how VBA coding is actually performed. So let's have our first attempt at some basic VBA coding. We're going to develop the coding in the coding window, and then we're going to apply it to a button that we already have on a PowerPoint slide. So you'll notice I already developed a button. I just said Insert Shapes, Action Button. In this case, there's another way right from the VBA screen we can also drag out a button. But I did this one through Insert Shapes. And I created two buttons so you could try it more than once. So the coding that we're going to ultimately put in there is this one over here, sub and end sub. And then we're going to use something called the message box. So we're going to type this behind the scenes in the VBA coding window. When we do this, here's what's going on. Sub starts the subroutine, end sub is of course the ending point of the subroutine. Display message box with the two parentheses are, that's just a name that I created for this subroutine. So when I see this come up in PowerPoint, I'll recognize what it is and I'll know what it does. Now the actual coding is right here. Message box is a reserved word. It's a command that will generate a message box in PowerPoint. So you'll see a box will just appear on the screen. And just as we did up here, having parentheses, the message box command gets also parentheses because we can insert something in there to interact with the message box. In this case, a message box will say, what text should I display? So in quotations within these parentheses, I put whatever text I want to use. Now, to create this, remember you're going to go into the Developer tab, and then you're going to click on VBA, Coding, or Visual Basic button, one of those two, to take you to that coding window. So I have just clicked on the View the Coding button, and here I am. I'm going to start by saying Insert a Module. Okay, so here is a screenshot of that module. Now I'm going to start by typing sub, and then I'm going to type the name. I'm going to say display message box and open and close the parentheses. Oh, look at that, it already typed end sub. Now, so I told you it would look like it's live and feel that way. Now I can say MSG box. Now, once I start doing this, oh, look at that. It opened up. It's again very interactive, and it's going to give me some information. So this is like a shortened form of all the different options that you have here. So I'm going to open the parenthesis, and I'm going to put quotes here, and I'm going to put some text here. And I'm going to say displayed in a message box. When I'm finished, I'm going to close the quote because this is a literal string. In other words, it's full text. And that's it. Now, if I, at this point, to finish the process, I've already created a button in PowerPoint. I've gone to the VBA coding screen. I've created the coding of what that button will do. Now I have to go back and associate that button with this coding, run PowerPoint, and it's ready to go. Now, back in PowerPoint, I just click the PowerPoint button to come back to the presentation. At this point, I clicked on the button to highlight it. And then I went to the Insert menu in the ribbon, and I said, Insert Action. So I could bring up these action settings. This action settings dialog is where we're going to associate the coding from the coding window. So notice those are like two separate areas. PowerPoint and coding window, we're going to associate what's on that coding window with a button on the PowerPoint slide. When I go into Action Settings, notice that something is available here that normally is not. Normally we can hyperlink somewhere. We could run a program, although most people don't get to do that. Or they play a sound. But here we can run a macro. And notice the macro that I created called Display Message Box with parentheses after, it's listed here. If I had more than one, I could select this drop-down arrow, and I could select from a list of all the code that are available on that screen. And then I say OK, and then I'll simply run the slideshow by either saying slideshow, run the show, or I will press the F5 key. When I press that action button, here's the result. So whatever text you typed, it will now appear in a message box. So two great ways to, again, more than two ways, but two great and popular ways to output information within PowerPoint through VBA. One is through a message box. You can see it pops up above and over the PowerPoint screen. Another way that we're going to try is going to be outputting text to a text box. Again, a very smooth kind of way to interact with students and to display this information. For our second coding challenge, let's use an action button to navigate to another slide. In the PowerPoint file that accompanies this lesson in Blackboard for our course, you'll find the slide looks like this. We're suggesting that one button will navigate us to slide number 1 or some other slide number, and then another button to navigate us to the next slide in sequence. So what coding will we use on the VBA editing screen in order to make these things happen? Well, in all cases, we're going to have to say sub and then give a name followed by two parentheses, open and closed. So depending on what you're doing, like you could say sub go to slide, or something of that sort, something that you're going to recognize because you're the only one who's going to see this. But it's important you can recognize what the subroutine will do. So three different ways we can do this. The syntax is we're going to say active presentation, which means this current presentation, dot slideshow window, dot view, which means you're going to navigate there and show it, dot go to slide, and then in parentheses put the number of the slide. Now you could do that. Now notice there's a whole bunch of different terms in here, different reserved words. So if you don't forget about my Dr. Steve's coding cheat sheet, because you don't have to memorize all of this, just so that you know what words you have to use in order to make this happen. Another way you could do this is, instead of saying go to a particular slide, you could say active presentation.slideshowwindow.view.next. And of course, next will take you to the next slide in rotation, or the same information, the same command words, view.previous. Now, one thing to note, on this screen, it looks like I'm putting these this line of coding on two different lines. That's just for presentation here in this video. Realize that after the word slideshow window, you continue right on with dot view dot whatever your next command is going to be. It's just all on one line. So once again, after adding this code in the VBA coding window, don't forget to press the PowerPoint button, navigate to regular PowerPoint, and then, as we did before, click on a button and then say Insert Action Settings, and that's where we get to say Run a Macro. And at that point, you'll now have more than one macro that's available. So macro simply means subroutines in the VBA coding window. So take this drop-down window, drop-down arrow, and open up the menu of all the codes that are available, and then don't forget to run the show as usual, F5 or slideshow, run the show. Press that button and then watch it work. Now, one quick word here regarding efficiency. While you can add VBA coding to navigate to another slide, don't forget that action settings for buttons and other objects in regular PowerPoint will automatically do this for you. All you have to do is say hyperlink to the next slide or a particular slide. You can use this tool as we traditionally would do in PowerPoint, or you could add the coding and do it here. So realize for some of the things we're looking, and not many, because there are so many things you can add to PowerPoint and other Microsoft applications through VBA, they don't have equivalents, they don't have more efficiencies in the actual application itself, like in PowerPoint. But in this case, this one does. So I could run the macro, or I could just say hyperlink to another slide, and that'll do the same thing for me with a little bit less effort. In order to add some text to a text box on the PowerPoint slide, start by inserting a text box in the regular PowerPoint. Select Insert from the menu and Text Box from the ribbon, and then draw or drag out a text box. Next, it's important to make sure you know the name of this object. And in fact, I suggest using some naming conventions and rename the object, because they're very wordy when PowerPoint creates them. So open the selection pane by going to the Home tab in PowerPoint and select. So here you see the select, and what we want to do is open up, in particular, this selection pane. When you do this, you'll now see a listing of all the objects on that particular slide, and that pane will remain open. Now rename the text box that you draw by clicking into the name of the object. So this is very interactive, so if you click on an object, you'll see it highlighted in this selection pane. And vice versa, if you click on the name of an object, you'll see the object highlighted. So that way there's no doubt as to which name belongs to which object. Now, to make it easier to refer to this in coding, try this naming convention. A text box will start with the small letter T, TXT, and then put the name that you create for this object. So for example, if I'm going to have several text boxes in which I'm going to use to output some information to a learner, I might say TXT output A or output 1, something like that, so that each object will have a unique name, and then I can refer to that object in the coding. So once again, the steps involved in outputting to a text box will be: number one, start by drawing a standard text box on a PowerPoint slide, and then go into that selection pane and change the name as desired. Again, I suggest that you do change it using that naming convention, TXT, and then give it a name, because otherwise, in PowerPoint, they've got several words. The text box will already have like about 4 or 5 words as the name. It's very involved and confusing. So change the name. Notice the number of the slide in PowerPoint. So you might be on slide number 5, slide 11. Whatever that slide number is, that's the one we'll be referring to in the coding. So, quick note, be careful not to move the slides around, because if you're referring to slide 5 and there's a new slide 5, that's going to change everything around. So once you create the slides, don't change them, or you have to update the coding. And then, as we did already, add a button back in regular PowerPoint in order to trigger that macro that VBA coding to run, and then we set that action setting on the button in order to make it work. So what type of coding are we going to place in the VBA coding window? Well, as usual, we're going to click into, of course, the VBA, view the VBA coding. We're going to start with sub and give it a name with open and close parenthesis, something that you're going to recognize, and then you're going to end it with end sub. That way we start and end the subroutine. This single line of coding is what we're going to place in this subroutine. Again, keep in mind, it looks like it's several lines here, but it's really one line of coding, and it's just on this screen, it's separated out into 3 lines to make it easier to read. Now let's take a moment and recognize what each of these commands is asking VBA to do. Number 1, we're talking about the active presentation. Okay, so what does that mean? We're referring to the current PowerPoint file. Slides, and in this case I have parenthesis 3. Now that 3 you can replace with whatever numbered slide you're on. So remember that in PowerPoint you have to take a look at what is the slide number. Next, it says dot shapes, and in shapes, notice in the parentheses and in quotations we have the name of the object. So I named my text box TXT output A. So again, I named that in the selection pane. And then we put text frame text range text. So we just put this in because this coding, when it's encountered by VBA, is going to say, oh, okay, so this is the text you want to put in to that text box. And of course, after that, we put all of that equals in quotations, because always when you're working with strings, which means text, literal strings, it's going to take whatever you type in between those quotations, and it's going to place that directly into, in this case, that text box. So all you have to do is, between the go sub and end sub, is type this line of text, replacing the number 3 after slides with whatever slide you're on and referring to, and in the name of the shape, make sure it's the actual name of the shape that you have named. That's your text box. And where I said worked in quotations, that's going to be whatever text you want to put into that text box. In the practice PowerPoint that accompanies this video in Blackboard, then you're going to find a slide that says the coding challenge, output to a text box, and I'll prompt you to use the next slide to create a subroutine to output some text into a text box. Now you don't just have to use the PowerPoint that I supplied. This will work, of course, in any PowerPoint file, as long as you're creating text boxes, you're creating buttons to trigger these events, and you saved your file as a PPTM for macro-enabled file. And as long as you don't forget to take the button, because this is a common mistake, someone will create the button, they'll name it, they'll go out and do some great coding, but then they forget to go back into PowerPoint and say action settings for that button, and they just forget to associate the VBA coding with the button. So the button is there, but it's got nothing to do. It never refers to the coding. I hope that this brief video gives you a chance to get the overview of coding. In future videos, we're going to take this further and see what great things we can do with VBA in PowerPoint. See you in our next video.